Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Georgia Tech heading into 2024. You got to think the main word for Brent Key, this Georgia Tech program, is going to be consistency. When you go back to the 2023 season, you look at the numbers, you turn on some games and say, from week to week, it just felt like different Georgia Tech programs. Now, I think the most exciting part about this Georgia Tech program, the highs were extremely high in 2023. Now, can you have more consistent highs in 2024? That's going to be the question for this Georgia Tech program. You look at the offensive side of the football, this can be one of the more dynamic offenses that we see in the ACC. Can they take the step on the defensive side of the football? That probably has a lot to do with what the ceiling is for this Georgia Tech program. We know they can score points. Can they get better on defense? That's the question. Fired up to get into this depth chart, take a look at the schedule, and kind of project this Georgia Tech program heading into 2024. Fired up to get into it. Before we do, as always, and just want to say thank you to you guys and for y'all who've been rocking with the fellas the last couple of years. These preseason reviews are some of my favorite episodes to do, where I get to learn a ton from you guys in the comment section. So let it fly in the comment section. Add some names to my notebook, and if y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. This Georgia Tech program, these game predictions, they're going to be really fun because this schedule is a blast for Georgia Tech in 2024. And without further ado, let's get into this one. You got to start on the offensive side of the football, where you have some of the more dynamic players that we see in the ACC: Haynes King, Jamal Haynes, Eric Singleton Jr. I want to start with Haynes King. And you saw Haynes King play some really good football at time for Georgia Tech in 2023. The biggest difference from the Haynes King we saw at Texas A&M to the one we saw at Georgia Tech was, Georgia Tech, Brent Key, this offensive staff, they leaned into what Haynes King can do from an athletic standpoint. You go back to the Texas A&M film, they treated Haynes King like a pocket passer, and you make no mistake about it. Haynes King led this ACC in passing touchdowns last year. He can push the ball down the field, but when Haynes King is at his best, he's getting outside the pocket. He's using his legs. He rushed for over 700 yards last year. Georgia Tech leaned into that. And when they did lean into that, that kind of unlocked a version of Haynes King that we weren't that familiar with. And I think going into year two within this Georgia Tech program, I think you could see Haynes King take another step in the right direction. Now, the one thing you're looking for is just play a little bit more within the offense. And you don't want to put Haynes King on a leash because he's the playmaker he is, because he does take risks, but can you do a better job walking that line in terms of making explosive plays, but also keeping the football out of harm's way? We said he led the team, or led the ACC in passing touchdowns last year. He also led the ACC in interceptions. Can he get better at taking care of the football, but also still making those explosive plays? That's the first question we have. You look at the running back room, Jamal Haynes, one of the best running backs in the ACC. You make no mistake about it, right? He ran for over 1,000 yards, averaged over 6.1 yards per carry, 46 missed tackles forced. You look at Haynes King and Jamal Haynes in the backfield, that's one of the more dynamic rushing attacks that we see in the country. They were 13th in the country in rushing yards per game. They were also 13th in the country in rushing yards per attempt. This is a dynamic rushing attack that can run the football in a lot of different ways. I would keep an eye on Trey Cooley as well, a kid that I love coming out of high school. A little bit of a different flavor than Jamal Haynes, a thicker lower half, a little bit more of a downhill running back. You got some really capable ball carriers in the backfield. You look at the offensive line and say, I think Brent Key has done a really good job developing a two deep on the offensive line, where you look at this offensive line and say, it's going to be a pretty solid unit in 2024. There's a lot of competition within that offensive line. I'm keeping my eyes on Ethan McKinney going into his second year. I thought he played some solid football as a true freshman. I mean, true freshman at the tackle spot, you're not supposed to play as a freshman. Ethan did. I thought he had some growing pains for sure, but started to put it together towards the end of the season. I look at the Georgia Tech offensive line and say, we're pretty comfortable. This unit's going to be pretty dang good. And then you look at the pass catchers, Eric Singleton Jr., one of the best wide receivers that we see in the ACC, only going to get better going into year two. You bring back your second leading receiver in Malik Rutherford. And then I would keep an eye on a guy like Chase Lane, who has just battled injuries, even going back to his time at Texas A&M. If he stays healthy, that's a really good 3 wide receivers for Georgia Tech heading into 2024 with some depth. Guys like Christian Leary coming from Bama a couple of years ago, they got some difference makers littered on the offensive side of the football. We feel pretty confident that this offense for Georgia Tech is going to be not only one of the better units in the ACC, but really one of the better units in the country heading into 2024. Now, I think the big question for Georgia Tech fans, can this defense take a step in the 2024 season? You go to the film of Georgia Tech last year, they struggled so much against the run. The numbers back it up, right? They gave up 5.4 yards per carry. That was 127th in the country. They gave up 223 rushing yards per game. That was 131st in the country. It was one of the worst rushing defenses that we saw in the country. Can they take that step? Because we all know as college football fans, if you can't stop the run and teams can just control the clock, eat up yards on the ground, it's really hard to consistently win football games. Now, Brent Key goes to the transfer portal and adds, I think, two fascinating prospects in Thomas Gore and Jordan Vandenberg from Penn State. So Thomas Gore coming from Miami, kind of a fire hydrant build. He goes about 6 foot, 285 pounds, plays with low pads. He's not going to be a guy that necessarily fills up the stat sheet, but he's a guy that can win at the line of scrimmage. He can deal with double teams and let his linebackers play a little bit more free. And then you look at Jordan Vandenberg and say, he's one of the strongest players in all of college football. If you're not familiar with Jordan Vandenberg, he was a JUCO kid, went to Penn State. The numbers that he put up in the weight room at Penn State, I saw some clips, they're silly numbers. Now, I think the question is, can he translate that strength in the weight room to strength on the college football field? That's another guy I'm keeping an eye on. And then Romello Height coming from USC. This is a kid that was coveted out of high school. At times when healthy, has played some really good football. I think he could be a guy that not only gives you some juice against the run, I think he could be the best pass rusher on this Georgia Tech defense as well. So you saw Brent Key say, yeah, we got to get better in the front seven. We're going to continue to get better in the front seven, but we need some immediate juice. They went to the transfer portal. They made that happen. A better defensive line is going to help the linebackers. Now, the linebackers weren't great for Georgia Tech last year, but I think a lot of it had to do with not a great defensive line, a defensive line that was losing at the point of attack, not letting those linebackers play free. If this defensive line gets a little bit better in 2024, I think that's going to help that linebacker room, where they went and added some intriguing names in the transfer portal, but I think you feel pretty good about some of the linebackers you have coming back as well. I look at the secondary and say it's a solid group. The secondary is not the question for this Georgia Tech defense. I think the front seven is, in terms of stopping the run. And again, you look at this Georgia Tech program, say, all right, we won 7 football games last year, being one of the worst rushing defenses in the country. We expect the offense only to get better heading into 2024. If this rushing defense just gets marginally better heading into 2024, this team is significantly better than it was in 2023. They did a really nice job forcing turnovers, 1.8 per game. That was top 15 in the country. You want to see that continue. If they get better stopping the run, this Georgia Tech defense takes a step. Now, I'm not going to get up here and say I think this Georgia Tech front seven is going to be one of the best units in the country against the run, but there are some reasons to believe that I think they get better going into 2024. Now, you look at the schedule. I think the schedule is really fascinating because there are a lot of big games, and I think what's so intriguing is you saw Georgia Tech play their best football against the best teams on their schedule last year when they weren't playing great teams. Sometimes they didn't play their best football. A game like Bowling Green, I'm sure Georgia Tech fans want to forget. But when they did play some of the better teams in the country, you saw Georgia Tech elevate their level of play. You open up week 0 against Florida State in Ireland. We said this when we previewed that game. This Georgia Tech team is going to come to play. And I think I'm not necessarily going to get up here and take Georgia Tech to win that football game. You look at Florida State, they got a transfer quarterback. They got a lot of transfers on both sides of the football. They have to replace 10 NFL draft picks. If there was a time that you wanted to get Florida State, you want to get them across the Atlantic Ocean in week 0, because it might take them a couple of games to kind of find their form. I think Florida State is going to be a very good football team in the 2024 season, but it might take a couple of weeks. So I think if you're Georgia Tech, you are very excited to get a team that went 13-0 last year. You're excited to get them week 1 in Ireland. You play Georgia State at home. That should be a win. They got a new coach. You go on the road to Syracuse. That's going to be a tough game. I think Syracuse made some really good additions in the transfer portal. Obviously, Fran Brown coming in. If you can win that game, you play VMI, you win, you start maybe 3-1 and kind of get some buzz around this Georgia Tech program. You go on the road to Louisville. That is not an easy place to play. I think that Louisville team is going to be awfully good. But again, we saw Georgia Tech. They played their best football when they were playing the best teams. Duke on the road at UNC. This schedule is not easy, right? You play Florida State in the ACC. You play Miami in the ACC. You play Notre Dame in Georgia as well. There are some tough games. I love the fact that you get Notre Dame at home. I think it's going to be Mercedes-Benz Stadium. That's going to be a very, very fun game. You go on the road to Lane Stadium, another tough place to play, and then you finish out with Miami off week, NC State, Georgia. It's a bear of a schedule. I mean, you don't play a ton of the bottom feeders of the ACC. You play a lot of really quality teams in the ACC like Virginia Tech, Florida State, Miami, NC State. Then you go on the road to Sanford Stadium with Georgia. It's a hard schedule. I think it's exciting for Georgia Tech because, again, we saw them play their best football against the best teams last year. I would expect Georgia Tech to be a better team. I don't know if they win 9 games because of how hard the schedule is. That being said, they certainly can if they do kind of find a little bit more consistency in the 2024 season. I think a really exciting team. I look at this schedule and I just kind of get fired up for all the game predictions that we are going to do for this Georgia Tech program. We'll cut it there. Appreciate you guys rocking with the fellas. Again, if y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Would love to hear from you guys in the comments section, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.